Welcome back to A Year of Final Fantasy, and this is the penultimate episode of the month of Diablos. And today we're going to be talking about Dragoons and Rangers, as well as some more jobs that we need to kind of catch up on, I guess. So let's get right into that. This is part 4 of the job series. So actually here, like I said, we're going to talk about 6 jobs in total. We're going to do 4 quick ones. I've normally been doing 2 quick ones. Last one only did 1. But this time we're going to do 4, and then we're going to do 2 jobs in a bit more of a heavy fashion like we do. So those are going to be Dragoons and Rangers. After this episode, during the next episode, the Final Fantasy V episode, we'll wrap up all of the other jobs that we missed and everything. So this is just a huge job month for us all. So now I'm going to do first 2 of the quick job discussions, and that's going to be about the Samurai and Ninja. Normally they're pretty much presented together as a pair, I guess. I don't know, being maybe Eastern origin. Samurais are more new to the franchise, I guess, compared to many of the jobs. They generally wield katanas, and they have a higher critical hit rate ability than your normal weapons. They do a lot of damage, basically, and the class itself has been associated with this money-throwing ability, which actually can do a ton of damage if used in the right way, and especially earlier on in the games. The second job that we'll talk about is, like I said, associated with the Samurai, but it's actually been a part of the series ever since the first game, and that is the Ninja. So ninjas, specifically in Final Fantasy V, wield 2 weapons, making them incredibly powerful, as well as they can use a little bit of elemental magic. They have these ninja scrolls that they can use with their signature ability, which is throw. So let's go ahead and get into our stars of the video, I guess, and that's going to be the Dragoons as well as Rangers. So we've talked about the Dragoons a little bit before, especially in the High Wind video. If you haven't watched our High Wind video, I recommend you watch that before you watch this one, but it's not required, I guess. But the High Wind video talks all about the High Wind lineage and their ties to Dragoons in the Final Fantasy franchise, so they're a very important part here that I could not leave out. Anyway, Dragoons made their first appearance in Final Fantasy II with Ricard Highwind. Since then, Dragoons have appeared in one form or another in most Final Fantasies since then. If not specifically in name and job form, they have abilities and items that bestow Dragoon abilities onto them. They've always appeared in the franchise since Final Fantasy II. The primary weapon of the Dragoon is that they wield spears, and more importantly, they have the jump command, which removes them from the battle for a period of time unable to attack until they fall down back into the battlefield, dealing damage, and then returning to the lines. So I'll run over the most notable Dragoon or Dragoons in each particular mainline franchise, but this doesn't include an exhaustive list of every Final Fantasy piece of media ever. That would just be insane to go through, and you know, this video is going to be pretty long as it is, so let's go ahead and just hit those high points right now. One thing I do want to go over before I start talking about the people being Dragoons is that in Final Fantasy VI, there's not really a Dragoon anywhere in that game, except for the fact that there are Dragoon boots, and those will give the wearer the jump ability. So I'm just going to get that right out of the way right now. So let's start with Final Fantasy II. Dragoons did not appear in Final Fantasy I. So Final Fantasy II, like I said, we have Ricard Highwind, and he's the first Dragoon ever introduced. Final Fantasy 3 and 5, though, they exist as jobs only with no real ties to the story. In Final Fantasy 4, we have debatably the best known Dragoon, and that would be Kain Highwind. And in Final Fantasy VII, we have Cid Highwind, and he's really the nexus of all kinds of Final Fantasy isms. Number 1, he's a Cid. We haven't talked about the Cid yet, but we'll do that in a video coming up soon. He's a Highwind, which I've already talked about, and he's a Dragoon. He's not a Dragoon in the main sense that he wears these dragon armor things, but he does wield his spears, and he has these limit breaks, these powerful attacks that basically are your different jump attacks. So Cid from Final Fantasy VII is like the Final Fantasy-ist character of them all. It's crazy. In Final Fantasy VIII, there's no real proper Dragoon to speak of except for Ward, who appears in backgrounds with Laguna and Heroes. He uses a spear, and his limit breaks in that game are also like our classic jumping abilities. In Final Fantasy IX, one of my favorite Dragoons is Freya, who belongs to this rat-like race. It's implied that she kind of has a backstory with Zidane, the main character, and it's pretty funny. but I like Freya just as she is in that game. And Final Fantasy IX is kind of really neat too, because Dragoons, at least Freya, she gets these dragon abilities, which are basic draconic magical attacks, and I really enjoyed that aspect. They haven't really done that with any other Dragoons since then. In Final Fantasy X, Kamari Ronso is also our resident Dragoon, even maybe not carrying that proper name. He does wield spears, and he jumps around, and pretty much everything that we know Dragoons to do. In Final Fantasy XI, Dragoon is a job, just like any of the more traditional games, Final Fantasy 3 and 5, with job systems like that. In Final Fantasy XII, Dragoons themselves don't really appear as you might expect, unless you've played the international version using the Zodiac system. I've played it, and it's fantastic. We're actually going to get a remake of that coming to the PlayStation 4 here in about a month as of this recording, and that'll feature this system as well. So you'll be able to get your Dragoon on in Final Fantasy XII with that special job system. So going on in Final Fantasy XIII, not explicitly a Dragoon, as many of our recent Final Fantasy games show, Fang kind of takes that Dragoon spot. On 13, she has a spear, she does the jump stuff, and she actually has a summon that's Bahamut. Dragoons in Final Fantasy are linked with dragons, usually in some way. In Final Fantasy 14, Dragoons have an incredibly large role near the end of the main story, and basically through the majority of the first expansion, that is Heavensward. I have to confess, I am a filthy casual Dragoon that everyone hates in the game, and I love it. I love my Dragoon. This brings us up to date with Final Fantasy 15, and it's one of the best additions to the Dragoon and Highwind lineage, and that's Aranea Highwind. I think I called her Arania or something like that, but it's Aranea, and she is one of the highlights of the entire game. She's my favorite character in that game, and she is just full on Dragoon there. Has the armor, has all of the personality. It's fantastic. Best thing that Final Fantasy 15 has given us, in my opinion. So, Dragoons, like I said, they're in most of any kind of other game that has jobs or job abilities or anything like that. Sometimes they're called Lancers, not Dragoons, just to make that clear, but we've covered all the major aspects of the 15 mainline games. So, with that, let's get on to our next two quick classes. The first class I want to talk about right now is the Beastmaster. The Beastmaster has started to appear in the later games, especially in games that feature a proper job system. In Final Fantasy V, they wear a pretty strange outfit, actually. They're basically like sheep, or in some cases a ram, I guess. They have wool and they have horns, at least some of them. And I don't really know what more to say with that. Kind of going the Geomancer's weirdness with what they wear. But anyway, Beastmasters can catch monsters and they release them to attack. Kind of sounds like another popular video game franchise you might have heard of, maybe. Some game where you catch monsters and then you battle with them. And that's pretty much about it. They're kind of like one-time summons that you can keep getting over and over and over again. And finally, we'll talk real quick about this next one, and that's the Mime. And the Mime is a super weird class idea. And this is the first time Mimes appear, but they do appear later on in the franchise as well. A Mime can mimic just about any ability from any job, save for a few. And their ability will actually repeat the same action as the most previously done action. So for instance, if somebody goes before you and they cast like Black Magic Ultima, you can do Mime and you can cast that exact same spell. So it's pretty interesting in that way. The Mime appears, like I said, in quite a few games, at least proper job games, and it's usually gained as one of the last jobs in the game because they're really not useful unless you have a wide variety of different people wielding different job abilities on the field. And with that being said, let's dive right into our next class. It's actually kind of two classes, but I'm just gonna focus on the one that is the Ranger. Rangers in Final Fantasy are like pretty much any other kind of Ranger in any other kind of fantasy RPG. They wield bows. At times, they cast white magic. Specifically, a few times that I go about, the argument can be made that Rosa in Final Fantasy IV, although clearly a white mage, she was a part ranger as well. She had some ranger abilities. Most rangers from a Final Fantasy game do one thing, and that's excel at killing enemies with a flying ability. There are a few classes that really heavily align with the Ranger, and for most intents and purposes can be switched out wholesale, and the big one that I'm talking about really is the Archer. So you have the Archer class that's appeared in a lot of the Ivalice-based games, the games that fall under Final Fantasy Tactics and the whole Ivalice realm. I guess Final Fantasy XII, you could make that argument as well. There's also the name given to them as Hunters, which appear in a lot of RPGs like World of Warcraft, and you can make arguments for the differences based on whatever games, but on the whole, I'm going to say Rangers, Archers, Hunters, they all pretty much wield bows and kill stuff in the air from the back lines. That's the general idea there. Now you can, call me out on that, but that's what I'm going to take them as. So let's talk about some of the most important Rangers in the series, aside from the ones that just only specifically use jobs. I'm talking about people with personalities that are defined by them being Rangers. And first up, I've already mentioned it, so I'll just again say it here real quickly, Rosa, who I think we all can agree is a white mage, but she does have those specific Ranger abilities, and that's why I do keep harping on that, because she has that aim ability, which is normally associated with Rangers. So she's a pretty interesting mix that you'll see with Final Fantasy. So jumping all the way from 4 to maybe 6, you could make an argument for Edgar, although there's a machinist class that appears in Final Fantasy, and that's what he would be more associated with, but he does use ranged attacks. In Final Fantasy VII, I don't know, there's not really a bunch of Ranger specifics. Barrett obviously fires from the backline. Vincent, you could make an argument, but he's different kind of thing altogether. I think the next real big one, though, that we can just associate with is Final Fantasy X being Wakka. So Wakka, you don't immediately think of blitzball players being a Ranger, right? Wakka was specifically designed to deal with flying enemies, and that's really what Rangers do. So despite his non-usage of a bow, I would feel comfortable putting him under the Ranger class. In Final Fantasy XII, for all intents and purposes, Fran is our resident Ranger, though the way that they gain abilities in that game is a little bit different depending on if you're using the Zodiac system or not. I think we can all agree that Fran is probably going to be the most Ranger-ish out of all of them. So Final Fantasy Rangers aren't really ingrained into the DNA of Final Fantasy, but they do appear in there, and they are very helpful, especially in the tactics games. And that's why I did want to put a spotlight on the Rangers, because they're more often than not overlooked, but they do have their purpose, and they do their purpose very well. And I think that's where we'll end it for now. We've covered a ton of jobs this month, 6 in this video. Next time we'll finish up our month of Diablos with another game which is just incredibly overlooked in the grand scheme of Final Fantasy games, Final Fantasy V. We'll take a real good look at that. And we'll see what Final Fantasy V brings to the table, and then we'll talk about what is going to happen going forward in a general franchise tonal shift. So, like always, until next time, Crystal Warriors, keep on gaming.